In London, the instability of the fledgling Islamic nation was now seen as a real threat to Egypt, Britain's key strategic interest in the region.
For the British, it was quite clear that there will be no stability in Egypt if Sudan was ruled by and controlled by a hostile nationalist regime. The Mahdist state was an exception, and this could not be tolerated.
To justify a new military operation against the Mahdiya, Sudan was presented to the British public as a human rights disaster in a carefully orchestrated campaign by a man who idolized Gordon. He was another imperial Christian evangelist, Reginald Wingate. Wingate, as head of intelligence for the Egyptian army, made it his business to disparage the Mahdiya as a corrupt and oppressive state. This was a matter of revenge, pure and simple.
Now, there is no doubt whatsoever that all reference to the oppression, the corruption, and so on, is an exaggeration. Wingate did encourage all writers to character assassinate the leaders of the Mahdist state, and also to depict it as corrupt, oppressive, in order to persuade public opinion in Britain to support the campaign to avenge Gordon.
Yet the Mahdiya was not going to self-destruct. It had to be defeated. 13 years were to pass before the British saw their martyr avenged, and they had to go to extraordinary lengths to do it. It took army engineers 2 years to build a railway from Egypt south across the Sahara Desert to Khartoum. 2,000 miles of track laid at 3 miles a day for the sole purpose of transporting an army of 20,000 soldiers to eliminate an enemy of the empire. This force was led by the ideal Christian warrior, a ruthless military technician and deeply devout man. Like Wingate, General Herbert Horatio Kitchener was one of Gordon's most avid admirers. When he found out that the invasion of Sudan had been ordered by the British government, Kitchener danced with joy. Now Kitchener and Wingate had the chance to avenge their hero and teach the dervishes an unforgettable lesson. What happened here at Omdurman in 1898 was the zenith of Victorian imperialism. The last hurrah of the generation that regarded world domination as its manifest destiny. The Battle of Omdurman was to pit the full military might of the biggest empire the world had seen against an army of desert tribesmen. This map shows where two worlds clashed. On one side, 50,000 desert-dwelling Islamic fundamentalists spread out across the plain of Kerari. On the other, 20,000 well-drilled British and Egyptian soldiers with their backs to the Nile. Standing in the British lines was the young Winston Churchill, a Harrow-educated army officer who had wangled his way into the force as a war correspondent for the Morning Post. What he saw astonished him.
The dervishes were now 2 miles distant, their line being, I estimated, 4 to 5 miles long and hundreds deep. It seemed to envelop our force altogether, and was truly an amazing sight. They were chanting ceaselessly, La ilaha illa wa Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is one God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God.
For Churchill, who rode fearlessly with the 21st Lancers into the Dervish lines, this was the most thrilling adventure imaginable.
The event seemed to pass in absolute silence. The yells of the enemy, the clashing of sword and spear, were unnoticed by the senses.
The picture lasted only a moment, but the memory remains forever.
The hungry and attentive Maxims opened fire on them, sweeping them all to the ground. Some in death, others in terror.
Kitchener called a halt to the massacre by saying, "Ceasefire, ceasefire, please. What a dreadful waste of ammunition." The Mahdist revolution had been blown apart by the discipline and firepower of a superior army. "11,000 dervishes died that day, and only 48 British and Egyptian soldiers. With the British and Egyptians now directly installed as Sudan's joint colonial rulers, that, finally, should have been the end of the Mahdi and his Sudanese jihad.
I was in the base of the building when this
Describe what you saw. You saw the second plane.
Looked like a deliberate act.
A deliberate action. We were all just watching it burn and people were jumping out of it. It was horrible.
The terror tactics of Al-Qaeda are the defining images of the early 21st century. A global network of dedicated militants striking fear into the heart of the West. The foundation for this organization was constructed in Sudan. Throughout British colonial rule in the 20th century, the Mahdi had remained a potent symbol of Sudanese resistance to foreign influence. Then, after 35 years of failed self-government, in 1985, Hassan al-Turabi, Sudan's spiritual leader, formulated a purist Islamic state which echoed the Mahdis. In 1991, he warmly welcomed Osama bin Laden into the country, fresh from his triumph against the Soviet army in Afghanistan.
Anyone who fights the Russians to you is a resistant mujahid. But once the Russians have gone, he himself retroactively becomes a terrorist. He is not a terrorist at all.
Remarkably similar in appearance to the Mahdi, Osama bin Laden came ostensibly as a rich Saudi businessman to invest in the Sudanese economy and to help develop some of the poorest areas. He bought over 1 million acres of agricultural land, established food processing plants, and a complex network of trading companies. One of his construction businesses built a highway 1,200 kilometers across the desert, from Khartoum to the Red Sea. It was also in Sudan that bin Laden set up camps in which hundreds of his followers could be trained in paramilitary tactics. It was from here that fighters were sent to Chechnya and Bosnia, and where attacks on targets in Saudi Arabia and the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were planned. Bin Laden internationalized his terror network in Sudan. This was the start of Al-Qaeda.
The fire does not touch me, covered in dust and the cause of Allah.
Despite the differences between Mahdism and Al-Qaeda, They represent attempts to deal with the same perceived problem, the weakness of Islam in the face of a dominant and corrupting foreign influence.
Muslims can look at what they perceive to be the control, the influence, the political and economic power of Europe and say, this is something that's been done to us. Our position has been undermined deliberately, and we must act against this. And the way that we can remedy our situation is to revive and renew our religion, and that should be the basis of a new Islamic culture.
The resentment of the involvement of the foreigners in the Islamic world is really very great, very strong, and that's why people who are living in misery, in dictatorial regimes, in poverty, they think they can do something similar to what happened before in Islam.
In bin Laden's case, there has been no Kitchener. In 1996, he was exiled from Sudan to Afghanistan at America's request. The Mahdi's memory continues to inspire a new generation. The appeal of his message reflecting the collective pride he touched among some Sudanese.
فكرة المهدية حتظل متقدة طوال جذوتها في صدور الناس، ما أظنها تنتهي بسهولة. لا زال الناس في أجيالنا الموجودة والبيجوا بعدنا عندهم ولاء للمهدية، لأنه ما عندنا تاريخ نتولى به ولا نتكلم ولا نتباهى به ولا نتفاخر به في وطننا ده.
I think that he has given to the Muslim people a sense of the power of people's power, that states and empires and so on are meaningless when confronted with the mobilization of a determined people.
Staying in Africa, Jeremy and the boys take on the bumpy roads of Botswana. It's going to be wild. Top Gear next on BBC Two. And a night of programmes focusing on extinction over on BBC Four starts now with an Horizon investigation into the day the Earth nearly died. And in an hour, a whistle-stop tour of Italy en route to Africa. Ewan and Charlie are revving up for Long Way Down here on BBC Two.